Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Daniel Mitchell. Daniel Mitchell is a leading tax expert and free market economist. Hello, Daniel. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
I'm great. So, Daniel, I have been reading you for a long time. Even when I was a teenager, I used to read your articles, and now we're meeting for the first time. Daniel, why are taxes important?
Well, according to Oliver Wendell Holmes, and this is etched above the IRS building in Washington, taxes are the price that we pay for a civilized society. However, when he uttered those words or wrote those words, the government, the federal government, was about what 5% of GDP, a tiny fraction of the size it is today, and so people have sometimes joked, can't we have less civilization? Because we definitely have a government that's too big, that's slowing down growth, reducing opportunity, and from a economic perspective, uh, people like me, we do two things. We try to focus on lowering the aggregate burden of government, so smaller government, which means lower taxes, but then we also try to make sure whatever type of tax structure there is, we wanted to do the least amount of damage per dollar raised. And so, for instance, instead of the complicated anti growth monstrosity of an internal revenue code that we have in the United States, why not have a simple and fair flat tax? Now, you can then have a separate debate, should the flat tax collect that much money or that much money? I obviously prefer smaller government. But those are the two big issues in taxes. How much is the government taking, and how are they taking it?
All right, Daniel. Daniel, let's talk about the myth of the tax deficit. Usually, whenever people hear the term tax deficit, they say, okay, that means that the government is not being managed properly. But my take is a bit different. The tax deficit is subjective. It is subjective. If there is a tax deficit, what does this mean? It means that you're going to rearrange how you organize and spend money. So if you usually spend $2 billion a year, because of the deficit, you should spend less. So I don't necessarily consider the tax deficit to be bad. What do you think?
This is a big part of the fiscal policy debates in Washington. We, of course, have very, very large budget deficits. Nobody in Washington really uses the term tax deficit, it's just budget deficit. Uh, and I have mixed feelings about that whole discussion because I agree with Milton Friedman. In the long run, what really matters is how much government is spending and whether it's financing that spending by borrowing, by taxing, by printing money. The damage is when you transfer resources from the productive sector of the economy to the government. So that's the problem. Spending is the issue. It's the number one thing we should focus on. However, if you view high taxes, high deficits, and money printing as symptoms of big government, well, those symptoms by themselves can be a major problem. Think about Argentina before Javier Milei, when the government basically financed its budget by printing at the central bank. You get inflation or even hyperinflation. So obviously, the symptom by itself can be a major challenge. Or think about government borrowing. I guess we can think of Greece about 15 years ago. Now, by the way, Greece has actually been moving in the right direction in recent years, but 15 years ago, they had a major economic crisis. Why? Because the symptom of government borrowing became so enormous, international investors didn't trust that the Greek government had the resources or ability to pay them back. There was a sudden fiscal crisis. There was no confidence in the Greek economy and in Greek politicians. So, yes, high deficits and enormous government debt by itself can become a big challenge. But again, I always come back to the main issue, which is that all of these problems are caused by government spending too much. So if you don't want hyperinflation because of government financing the budget with printing money, control government spending. If you don't want a Greek style debt crisis, have the government spend less money. If you don't want enormous confiscatory taxes, have the government spend less money. So the budget deficit and enormous government debts can be a problem, but it always comes back to the fact that we have a government that is simply spending too much money in ways that are hurting our economy.
Daniel, a projected deficit is an indication that you should spend less. So I'm agreeing. I am not impressed by the argument of the deficit. If there's a deficit, you spend less. Remember, our tax dollars don't belong to the government. We pay them to the government because of force. The government is a parasite. Without us being productive, the government can have no money. People should stop thinking that that their tax dollars are an entitlement. It's not a government entitlement. You're doing it because of force. You're not obligated to share your wealth with the government. So there's an income tax. Some of us use public services, so we pay the income tax. We might pay a sales tax. But should there be an inheritance tax? Should there be a tax on PayPal? No. There's no reason for us to assume that the government should have a piece of all of our assets. That doesn't make any sense.
The challenge with government is that you can't have a good tax system if you have a big government. Now, of course, I'm a libertarian philosophically, so I instinctively don't like any taxes. But if we're going to assume that some government is going to exist and that some taxes will be needed to finance it, then I want to make sure that those taxes do the least amount of damage possible. Now, historically, if you go back to the 1800s, because government was very small back then in the Western world, you could finance government with a few excise taxes, a few trade taxes. I mean, Donald Trump actually says, let's go back to that system. But of course, he forgets about the fact that you have to dramatically shrink the size of government in order to make that possible. So once you sort of move from government being 2 or 3 or 4% of GDP, where you can finance it with just a few incidental taxes, once it gets a bit bigger, then you probably have to have a broad-based tax of some kind. And among market-oriented economists, the goal has always been to have a low-rate consumption-based tax. Now, a consumption-based tax to the average person sounds like a national sales tax, or maybe something like a European-style value-added tax. And if you're financing a government of 5 or 10 or 15% of GDP, that's certainly one option. However, in the world of public finance economics, a consumption-based tax can also be an income tax where there's no double taxation of saving and investing. So a conventional Hall-Rabushka style flat tax, that would be an example of a consumption-based tax. Why? Because there's no capital gains tax, no double tax on dividends, no death tax, no wealth tax, no double tax on savings. So in effect, when you think about a national sales tax and a flat tax, they're just different sides of the same coin. A national sales tax taxes your income one time at one low rate when you spend it. A flat tax taxes your income one time at one low rate when you earn it. Either one of those systems is much better than the current tax code that we have in the United States, where you have all the double taxation, all the corrupt loopholes, all the complexity. And again, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. How much does the government tax? But then how does it tax? And what really irks me is that not only is the government taking a lot of our money, but they're doing it in a way that almost certainly maximizes the damage or imposes much more damage than necessary in order for the politicians to collect revenue.
All right, Daniel, there is a policy I want you to explain. In America, if let's say, for example, you work in New York, but you're from Florida, why would you pay taxes in Florida and New York? I was listening to a documentary once, and a lady was saying she works in one state, but she's from another state and she's paying both taxes. Why?
Well, this deals with something that is called nexus. In other words, what is the connection of a taxpayer to a taxing jurisdiction? Now, because we have a federal system in the U.S., not as much federalism as we should have, because the central government has gotten bigger and more powerful over time, but we still have a federal system. And so let's think about, well, let me give you an example where nexus is very appropriate. I live in Connecticut and I go to work in New York City. So I'm a tax resident of Connecticut, but I'm earning income in New York. Even for a libertarian like me, I can see the argument that, well, New York should have the right to tax you at least on the income that you earn in New York, not any other income, certainly, but the income you earn in New York. Okay, yeah, I guess the New York State government, and for that matter, the New York City government, would have a plausible case for taxing you. But what if you're a remote worker? And this is I guess, the example you were giving me. You're a remote worker. You live in Florida. You never set foot in New York, but you happen to work for a New York company. Does that give New York nexus, or the right, the authority, the ability to tax you? That's where I get much, much more skeptical about arguments about nexus and taxing authority. I want to make sure that governments only tax things that occur inside their borders. And if someone lives in Florida and happens to contract with and do work for a company based in New York, the New York government can tax that New York company, but I don't think they should be able to tax the person who's living and working in Florida.
All right. Who pays the corporate tax?
Well, technically, or administratively, I should say, the company pays the tax in that they actually remit the money to the government. But when economists are looking at this issue, they're considering who actually bears the burden of the tax. And when you're talking about corporate income taxes, there's overwhelming agreement that companies simply collect the taxes. The burden of the tax is actually borne by individuals. Now, it could be that the corporate tax is paid by individuals as workers at the company. It could be that the corporate income tax is paid by consumers who buy the company's products. And it could be that the corporate income tax is paid for by the shareholders, the owners of the company, who wind up having fewer profits and lower dividends as a result of the corporate income tax. So the corporate income tax administratively is paid by the business, but it's definitely 100% individuals are paying the burden. Now, my own personal assessment of the academic research on this issue is that shareholders are sort of the immediate victims of corporate income tax. However, because the corporate income tax on shareholders leads to less investment, makes the company less profitable, and things like that, then you have secondary effects on workers and consumers who wind up suffering as well. So shareholders are the main victims, but the secondary victims are workers and consumers who wind up, depending, of course, on the market and for different products and things like that. Workers and consumers definitely bear some of the burden of the corporate income tax as well.
What's the relationship between the corporate tax rate and economic growth or business formation?
Every economic theory, I mean, even Marxism, even socialism, literally every economic theory that I'm familiar with, and I think I'm familiar with all of them, they all agree. You have to have capital formation, saving and investment to have long run growth. It's sort of like, think about it in a simple agricultural example. A farmer has to set aside some of his crop, seed corn, in order to plant next year's crop. So you need to set aside some of today's income to finance tomorrow's growth. Now, we're talking about this in the sense of a corporate income tax, but any business tax system. And maybe let's remember, most small business owners pay through the individual income tax system. They're not paying the corporate tax technically, but it all works out to be the same thing. If you want to invest, whether through a corporate structure or just a regular sole proprietorship for a small businessman, if the government is taxing your investment by having depreciation instead of expensing, by having either high corporate or individual income tax rates, that is going to reduce your incentive, either as a corporate manager or as an individual small business owner. You're not going to invest in as much. You're not going to take risk. You're going to be less likely to be entrepreneurial. And all these things combine to have less capital formation in your economy. Now, that's obviously bad for the owners of businesses, but guess who else it's bad for? It's bad for the rest of us, because as workers, our value, when we take a job, our value is dependent on how much we produce. But if there's less investment in the economy, we're not going to be as productive, because we're not going to have the advanced technology, equipment, and things like that to work with. So it's very, very important to have more investment, more capital formation, more innovation, more entrepreneurship in your economy. And high taxes on businesses, and specifically high taxes on investment, definitely discourage capital formation, discourage saving and investing, and as a result means lower productivity in your economy, and that directly translates into lower wages for workers. So we want the tax burden to be very, very low, and we especially don't want discriminatory taxes on saving and investing, which is a very, very common problem throughout the world.
All right. I have been following the literature on the wealth tax. The wealth tax does not work. It's not even working in Norway. Norway, it has led to capital flight. But what about Switzerland?
So Switzerland is a very strange case because it's one of the most free market economies in the world, very successful, very prosperous. They forego many types of double taxation. So if you don't want to have high taxes on dividends and capital gains and things like that, Switzerland's a good place. However, they have made the choice at the canton level to impose wealth taxes. Now, it's sort of a trade-off. They have a wealth tax. They shouldn't, but in exchange for not having a wealth tax, you don't have many of these other examples of double taxation on saving and investing. So the bottom line, from my perspective, is that the Swiss system is not perfect. It's just better than most other countries. The problem with other countries that have wealth taxes, think about Norway or Spain or France, is not only do they have the wealth taxes, but then they have the capital gains taxes, the double taxes on dividends. They oftentimes have death taxes. And so you wind up, double, triple, quadruple taxation of income that is saved and invested. Switzerland, again, isn't perfect. They do have this unfortunate wealth tax, but they don't do it nearly as bad as some other countries. And of course, their overall tax burden, at least by European standards, is relatively low.
Is a wealth tax ethical?
Well, as a
Or
libertarian,
should I say moral? Moral is a better word. Is it moral?
as a libertarian, I have a hard time thinking any tax is moral. And so I always am reminded of the words of one of America's great presidents, Calvin Coolidge, when he said, I won't have the quote exactly, but he said something to the effect that collecting more taxes than is necessary is legalized robbery. So if you have a small government that is financing genuine public goods like rule of law and a court system and things like that, okay, I might not like taxes. I might still have a libertarian, just instinctive dislike of taxes, but I understand that you're getting value for your money with that kind of system. The problem is that when you have a wealth tax, every single country that has a wealth tax has a government that is far, far too big. And so then I can sort of let my inner libertarian come out and be just very moralistic and say it's reprehensible that not only does someone earn money, they pay tax on the money. If they then save and invest the money, we're probably going to double tax them with dividend taxes, corporate income taxes, capital gains taxes. But then on top of that, we're going to impose a wealth tax. That to me is immoral. In the same way that I think a death tax is immoral. Dying should not be a taxable event. You earn money, you pay tax on the money, then you get double tax when you save and invest it. And then just because you die, you're going to get taxed again. So in the grand scheme of things, from a public finance economic perspective, death taxes and wealth taxes are probably two of the worst taxes you could ever have in a country in terms of the economic damage that you do per dollar collected.
I agree. I don't know your position on this issue, but intergenerational wealth is a positive. I don't view that as a negative. I think if a family can maintain wealth for 500 years, that shows exceptional planning and intelligence.
I'm a big believer in intergenerational wealth, not because necessarily every single one of your kids is going to be responsible if you leave them money. I mean, we can all think of examples of, who is it, Paris Hilton, who just basically exists to be famous or something like that. Not as famous as she used to be, but she basically lived off inherited money. And you have actually a lot of also left-wing people. Their parents are rich. They inherit a lot of money. They feel guilty about it, and they become what are called trust fund leftists or champagne socialists and things like that. So I'm not saying that every single person who inherits a lot of money uses that money responsibly or has sensible views. But from an economic perspective, having that money in capital markets, invested in businesses, invested in the economy, that's good for the rest of us. So
Exactly.
even if Paris Hilton winds up being an irresponsible heiress, the rest of us benefit by the fact that the Hilton family, I guess their fortune came from hotels. That money has created lots of jobs and lots of wealth for the rest of us.
Exactly.
So yes,
It's a
intergenerational
source.
wealth is a good thing.
It is a source of capital formation. When rich families maintain their wealth for several generations, we have more money because many of these rich families they invest in VC companies, they start new businesses, and they have managers who manage their resources.
You're exactly right. We want there to be more capital formation, more saving and investing in the economy, because that is literally the recipe for higher productivity and higher pay for workers. And so I'm always mystified by people on the left who hate the rich. Now, there might be some rich people who get money by stealing it, by using government cronyism or stuff like that. But rich people who create new products and are entrepreneurs that create wealth, develop new things that make the rest of our lives better. Those rich people make the rest of us better off. No question about it. The economy is not a fixed pie. And I think this is an important point to discuss. Many of our friends on the left, they sort of think of the economy as sort of a certain amount of wealth. And if someone like Bill Gates or Elon Musk has a lot of wealth, they think that means that there's less wealth for the rest of us. That's not right. Over time, we can all become richer. As a matter of fact, that's the history of Western economics. Everyone in the world used to be poor several hundred years ago. But then once free markets began to spring up, and government, dictatorship and kings and whatnot began to be constrained, and the rule of law came in, we all of a sudden everyone began to get much richer. And so those of us who live today, especially in Western societies, are 10, 20 times richer than if you go back 4, 5, 6 generations. So we can all become richer, and we all become richer when there's more saving and investing. So we should applaud when there are more rich people, again, assuming they earn their money honestly, which most of them do in capitalist economies.
Exactly. In the West, most billionaires are not crony capitalists. Not at all. But that's what I usually tell people because they say, okay, rich people they stole their money, they're corrupt, and I say no. Rich people are likely to be corrupt in poorer countries. In countries like America and the UK, most rich people earned their money.
Yeah. Or to be fair, maybe some of the rich people inherited their money, but as long as their parents or grandparents or whoever earned the money honestly, uh, I have no objection to that. Now, do I wish maybe that I had been born to wealthy parents? I mean, sure. Wouldn't it be nice to inherit a lot of money? But I think envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, and I think a lot of left wing economics is just motivated by envy against successful people.
Yes, and not only is envy a sin, there is a negative relationship between envy and economic growth. I've read Boris Gershman, I've read Soul Tax, Murray Rothbard wrote about Soul Tax, and I've read other people. Envy is negatively associated with economic growth. In envious cultures, people are less likely to be productive because if you're too productive, you're going to encounter backlash.
Yeah, and it's not just backlash. You're going to wind up having government confiscate your wealth, expropriate your property, levy confiscatory taxes, and so here's the thing that I wish I could get my left wing friends to understand: government has the power to punish rich people. However, government can't help poor people. Government can only get in the way. Only capitalism has ever delivered. It's the only system to ever deliver mass prosperity anywhere in the world. So, and this, I actually have one of my theorems of government, which is that the left wants to punish rich people, the free market people want to help poor people. We want to create a more vibrant, dynamic economy that gives poor people a chance to rise. Whereas our friends on the left, they're so consumed by envy that they do the class warfare policies that, yes, they can successfully hurt the rich, but those policies never help the poor.
Do regulations work? Left leaning people like to advocate for regulations, but do they ever help poor people?
The overall regulatory burden is one of the most important measures to look at when trying to figure out whether an economy is going to grow fast, create more jobs, and things like that. Now, I think it's important when we talk about regulation to distinguish between private rules and government red tape. So if you build as a developer, if you build a shopping center, all the roads in that shopping center, the parking lots in that shopping center, they're not going to be subject to government rules. But guess what? Those private developers still have car lanes where, at least in most countries, you drive on the right. They paint the lines for the parking lot. The big giant mall that they're building, in effect, has indoor pedestrian streets, and they design everything with certain rules. So rules by themselves are part of a civilized society. So you don't need government necessarily to come in and say, oh, everyone has to behave a certain way, because the private sector is going to have efficient forms of private governance. The problem is when governments come in and start doing regulations, I guess it's benign if they're simply replicating what the private sector would do anyhow. Let me give you another example. For consumer products in the United States, you look on certain products, you'll see something certified by Underwriters Laboratory, a private testing service that in effect measures and gauges whether products are well made and are not dangerous. Well, government can come in and pass regulations to do the same thing, but you know what? Those government regulations are going to probably be a lot more expensive and not get you any better consumer benefits. So I'm very skeptical of government regulation. I'm not skeptical of rules and traditions, especially coming out of a system of private governance and contract enforcement.
Companies, industries, they can regulate themselves. They can name and shame people. And for most of history, that's how we operated. Today, however, I find it quite strange that countries in the West, they achieved economic growth by lowering taxes. Today, they're now telling poor countries to regulate their economies, and they also promote social spending and higher taxes. So these days, you have been a critic of multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and even the OECD has become quite left leaning. The OECD used to argue that low taxes promote economic growth. These days, people at that level, they talk about the global minimum tax. Why?
The problem with multilateral organizations, international bureaucracies like the OECD, like the IMF, those two I think are the worst, is that who appoints the people to these bureaucracies? The governments do, that are the member countries of these bureaucracies. And governments, they want to make life easier for politicians. I mean, politicians appoint people to the IMF. They appoint people to the OECD. They're going to make life easier for politicians. And that means in the context of tax policy, they would rather create a cartel to make it easier for politicians to raise taxes, even if those bureaucracies originally had a mission of promoting economic growth. Inevitably, it seems that bureaucracies wind up being captured by people with a left-wing agenda. Again, why? Because politicians appoint those kind of people because they want the bureaucracies to serve them rather than serve people. And so, yes, the OECD was founded originally to be a free market alternative to the Soviet bloc's Comecon, but now the OECD is very left-wing and pursues an agenda of tax harmonization. It's always pimping for higher taxes and things like that. Now, by the way, to be fair, not just at the OECD, but at the IMF and the World Bank, you do have economists who produce working papers that have very good findings.
Exactly.
So it's not that every one of these bureaucracies is bad, It's just at the policy making level, that's where when those bureaucracies tend to do the wrong thing. Now, by the way, let me give you an example that's actually contrary to what I just said. During the 1980s and 1990s, there was a period known as the Washington Consensus. And you had people like Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK. You had sort of free market oriented leaders. And that was a time when the IMF and the World Bank, by and large, gave good advice and tried to encourage countries to liberalize. And to be fair, even today, the IMF and the World Bank, on issues like trade and regulation, they tend to be somewhat market oriented. It's on public finance issues, taxes and spending. That's where those bureaucracies tend to be really, really bad. And since I'm primarily a public finance economist, I'm very critical of the OECD, very critical of the IMF, because they're doing the wrong thing.
But Daniel, I was born in Jamaica, and too infrequently do we hear a right wing voice from West Indian countries. I started out as a conservative, then I became a libertarian. And today I am not fond of agencies like the World Bank and the IMF because their regulatory policies do not account for economic freedom. They don't mention economic freedom in their report. So the IMF will go to a country in Africa or the Caribbean and the IMF will propose trade liberalization, but the IMF will not advocate for economic freedom and creating an economy that promotes growth based on the principle of economic freedom. Why is that word omitted from the IMF reports?
Well, I think the problem is that at the top of these bureaucracies, you have political appointees who who are who know one thing, that they know that they were appointed by politicians. And if you have politicians in the major countries of the world with a left-wing perspective, like Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom, we had Joe Biden for years in the U.S. You had a social democrat government until recently in Germany. France, no matter who's president, they're always left-wing, it seems. So the big countries of the world, the so-called G7 countries, they tend to have left-wing governments, and those left-wing governments appoint people at the IMF and the OECD that are just going to pursue bad policy. And again, 25 years ago, 35 years ago, during the era of the Washington Consensus, you actually had some good ideas coming out of international bureaucracies, but not anymore. Again, I want to be fair. They're not. They can sometimes even be good on regulatory and trade matters. But you're right. They never talk about economic freedom as a good thing in and of itself. They sort of give this technocratic advice. Oh, well, you should liberalize trade, which, okay, I'm glad. But they should say you should liberalize trade because economic freedom creates more prosperity. Now, let me go on a little tangent here because I think this is important. I am very, very critical of the IMF. I've written dozens of columns criticizing the IMF for pushing higher taxes in different countries. But you know what? To be fair, the IMF is primarily focused, at least in terms of its work on public finance, it's primarily focused on government red ink, high deficits, high debt. Let's now look at the example of Argentina under Javier Milei, who is by far the best political leader in the world today. Javier Milei, when he came into office, Argentina had a giant deficit, enormous government debt. And what did Javier Milei do? He slashed government spending. And I'm talking real spending cuts, not the phony kind of spending cut you get in Washington where spending grows by 4% instead of 8%. Javier Milei reduced government spending by 30% in his first year, the largest fiscal consolidation spending cut in history. And guess what? The IMF hasn't argued against him, because the IMF is simply concerned mostly, first and foremost, about getting rid of government deficits and controlling government debt. The problem is that in 99.9% of countries, when they have a budget deficit, when they have high government debt, what do politicians want to do? They simply want to grab more tax money. And so you're the IMF, you come into a country, the politicians are telling you, well, we're not going to cut spending. And then the IMF says, okay, well, why don't you raise this tax and that tax and this tax and that tax? If you have more good governments in the world, the IMF might not be so bad. But here's the challenge. I sort of defended the IMF because they're not being a hindrance to Javier Milei. The problem is that instead of coming in and bailing out these countries and recommending higher taxes, the IMF should simply say, well, you had too much spending. You have a lot of government debt. I guess you just have to deal with it. I mean, think about it this way. If we have relatives and our relatives are being very irresponsible and they go into credit card debt and then they go out and they go gambling and stuff like that, and they wind up getting fired from their jobs, do I or do we give our relative who's being irresponsible lots of money?
No.
No, we don't want to do that. Or we say, okay, I'll give you a little bit of money, but you have to shape up, stop drinking, stop gambling, get a job. So maybe you help them a little bit, but in a very conditional way. You don't simply say, okay, well, here's more money to bail you out of your bad decisions, because guess what? That's going to encourage more bad decision making. That's what the IMF does when it bails out countries. What should happen if a country like, let's say, Argentina before Javier Milei got all sorts of bailouts from the IMF. What the IMF should have done is said, okay, you ran up a lot of government debt, deal with it. Maybe you default, and guess what? That will teach international investors not to buy your bonds anymore, just like you don't lend money to someone who's not credit worthy. So the IMF, basically should not exist. Because it only exists basically to bail out irresponsible countries and oftentimes to push for higher taxes as part of those bailouts. So by all means, get rid of the IMF, get rid of the OECD. These bureaucracies are a net negative for global prosperity.
Daniel, I don't doubt the intelligence of people who run countries or people who run the IMF. But sometimes politicians, because of populism, they speak like idiots. Perfect example. The IMF and the World Bank are lenders of last resort. The IMF and the World Bank are not the reason for the poor state of the economies of developing countries. Without those organizations, developing countries would be in a worse position. So there's this argument that the IMF and the World Bank, they should cancel the fiscal liabilities of developing countries, and developing countries are poor because of the IMF and the World Bank. And I'm like, the IMF and the World Bank are subsidizing the economies of developing countries. Without those organizations, developing countries would be in a worse position. So many people can't see that.
National governments in developing countries are 99% responsible for poverty because they have governments.
I live in one. You have never lived in a developing country. I lived in one. Most of these people who are bashing the World Bank and the IMF are clones. They have never lived in a poor country.
Or they come from a poor country, but they're part of the elite.
Okay.
So if you're like the nephew of a prominent politician, you might get a job at the IMF or the World Bank or something like that, because they actually have quotas for employment where you have to have all the different countries that are members being represented. But my problem is that, and by the way, this is the same analysis that I use when giving speeches in Europe and talking to countries that are members of the European Union. Overwhelmingly, when a country is poor, 99% of the blame should be leveled against the politicians in that country. Now, does the IMF especially contribute to bad policy by doing bailouts and giving those politicians cover to raise taxes? Yes, the IMF especially plays a pernicious role. I think the European Union also pushes for tax harmonization and centralization and more bureaucracy in Europe. The OECD, of course, is pushing its global tax harmonization agenda. So I don't like any of these international bureaucracies, but I can't help but when I look at the data, it's still, if there's a poor country, the overwhelming blame belongs with the politicians from those countries. Why? Because they pursue populist policies. They're obeying public choice economics, which is that if you want more power as a politician, you do demagoguery and big government, because people are not farsighted enough. They don't understand enough economics to realize that if you have things like price controls and rent controls and taxes on the rich and minimum wage laws, these are all things that hurt your long run prosperity. But a lot of people who don't have any training in economics, oh, that sounds nice. And of course, it's disastrous.
Yeah, exactly my point. So my 2 degrees are in history, but I do a lot of economic research. I read quantitative papers, and I upgrade my skills over the years. In Jamaica, there was a program called the Taking Responsibility Project, and the program concluded early, but it found that Jamaican poverty at that time was attributable to defective policies. This was maybe around 20 years ago. Since then, guess which country has become the superstar of the IMF? Jamaica. Independent central bank, growing economy, although economic growth is slow, the country's unemployment rate is at a record low, poverty is trending down, and we reduce our fiscal liability within a short time period, within less than 10 years. Even magazines from France are talking about Jamaica. The Brookings Institution has a publication on Jamaica. It was published maybe last year or earlier this year by Peter Blair Henry and his co-authors. Surprisingly, enough people are not talking about the Jamaican miracle. Have you been following it?
I have not followed the Jamaican economic policy. Matter of fact, I've written close to 8,000 columns. And I think the only one I ever wrote about Jamaica was like 15 years ago. And I simply pointed out that Singapore and Jamaica had the same living standards in the early 1960s. And then Singapore shot way ahead because it had much, much more economic freedom. But if Jamaica has been doing economic liberalization and reducing the burden of government, I'm not surprised that things have gotten better, because that's the same thing we see anywhere and everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter whether countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia and Europe. When you have free markets and limited government, you get good results. But when you have more statism, more centralization, more government, you tend to get bad results. And there are some countries that sort of go against the grain. They become either superstars or super failures. Oftentimes, when I'm writing about Latin America, I point out that Argentina historically was one of the super failures, but now under Javier Milei, it's getting great results. Venezuela, unfortunately, has been a disaster for 25 years, and they're getting terrible results. Chile had a lot of good free market reforms, but then sort of plateaued. And so basically, the world is a laboratory, and the different countries in the world are like experiments in that laboratory. And what do those experiments teach us? Over and over again, it teaches us that free markets and limited government are the only recipe for national prosperity.
Jamaica doesn't have a capital gains tax. We don't have an estate tax. We reduce business taxes, and we might abolish the asset tax soon. So I would say that the country is heading in the right direction. I'm not living there anymore, but it's good to be an influential member of diaspora abroad. Rather, for me personally, I think instead of saying that you're from somewhere in Africa or the Caribbean, and you use that opportunity to talk about corruption and economic failures, sell your country, because the state and the individual are different, but the perception of the individual is usually based on the country. So if Jamaica is a poor corrupt country and you are from Jamaica and you're saying that Jamaica is poor and corrupt, people are going to perceive you as poor and corrupt. But if Jamaica is poor and corrupt but it's doing well, and you're always saying that Jamaica is doing well, they're going to think highly of you.
Well, I remember who was the crazy person that Jamaica had, Michael Manley.
Yes, it was a disaster. From 72 to 1980, 25% contraction in the economy. Not only did the economy contracted, but there was a commission called the Pickersgill Commission of Political Purity, and that was a political commission that was established to purge the civil service of right-leaning people. There was also a member of his cabinet who said that a particular garage was too clean, so he had to make it dirty. It was a crazy administration, but Jamaicans love him.
Well, that was a very unfortunate period in Jamaica's history, and so I'm very glad that people seem to have learned somewhat, and that Jamaica is moving in the right direction. What I always do when I am looking at a country, is that I'll go to Economic Freedom of the World, published by the Fraser Institute, or the Index of Economic Freedom, published by Heritage, and I'll look up, what a country's scores are. Are they good on some issues, like maybe fiscal policy, but bad on other issues like monetary policy? Are they good on everything? Are they bad on everything? And you could learn a lot about seeing what the trend lines have been for economic freedom in the various countries of the world.
Yeah, so a downside of the IMF report was that there's an agency in Jamaica called JACRA. And JACRA is a parastatal. We don't need a parastatal anymore. But the IMF report had nothing to say about the parastatal that's ruining agriculture. In Jamaica today, farmers farmers and manufacturers, they comply with certain regulations because of JACRA. JACRA makes money. JACRA extracts resources from the agricultural sector without sufficient investments. So that's one downside of the IMF program. It doesn't pay significant attention to economic freedom reform.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also another issue which we should have mentioned earlier, but we didn't, is that billionaires are an indication of productivity. No billionaires means that there's a ceiling on productivity. You don't want to live in a world without billionaires, because if billionaires don't exist, it means we're not being innovative, we're not being productive.
Well, again, we have to also specify, though, that you want to make sure the billionaires are the right kind of billionaires, that they earn their money honestly. I'm actually, while we're talking here, I'm calling up Jamaica on the Economic Freedom of the World website, and you can see that Jamaica bottomed out in 1980, I guess because of Manley, and then dramatically increased economic freedom between 1980 and 2000 during the period of the Washington Consensus. But now, unfortunately, there hasn't really been much progress in Jamaica in recent years. So I'll be very curious as the next issues of economic freedom in the world are released. Are we going to begin to see an increase because of these reforms that you're talking about?
No, the problem with Jamaica, Daniel, is that we don't really have a civil society. In Jamaica, people refer to civil society, but civil society in Jamaica is a group of people who criticize politicians for being corrupt. We don't have agencies like Heritage and Brookings, no Americans for Tax Reform, no Innovation Foundation. There is a group that was started by Professor Rapley. It's still in Jamaica now, but beyond that, we don't really have a formal civil society that will propose policies and work without being supported by the government. So a group like, what's the name of your group again? Center for Freedom and Prosperity?
Yeah, I'm with the Center for Freedom and Prosperity.
Yes, we don't have groups of that nature in Jamaica. And that's why, even though we're currently undergoing a wave of economic reforms, people don't mention economic freedom. It is never mentioned.
Well, what I would recommend is people like you, part of the diaspora, you should write columns for the newspapers
That's what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing. But what I do believe that one person can make a difference. But I'm not naive. I was speaking to somebody in Jamaica recently, and I was saying, look, if the prime minister is doing so well, or if he thinks that he's doing so well, then his advisors should be writing columns for Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. They should have that brand strategy to propel the country forward. But the reality is that such ideas are lacking at that level.
Yeah, well,
they care about politics. That's what they care about. Only politics, nothing else.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with politicians.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not just the politicians, but the Jamaica's intellectual class is really different. I don't consider the intellectual class in Jamaica to be particularly innovative. They don't move the needle. They repeat what they hear from people abroad, especially left-leaning people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and yeah, that's a serious matter, because we can always reform the economy. We can always talk about economic freedom, but elites lead. And if the elites are low quality, we don't have much hope.
Well, my view is that Jamaica should copy the Cayman Islands.
Yes, we're getting to that now. Anti-money laundering regulations, do they make any sense?
Well, no, they in the sense that whether they reduce crime, they don't at all. Anti-money laundering regulations are mostly a way for politicians to try to destroy financial privacy because they think that that's a way that they can collect more taxes. But the official, the stated reason for anti-money laundering laws is that, oh, if we make it difficult for people to use the proceeds of crime, there'll be less crime. But all the academic research has shown that anti-money laundering laws impose very high costs on financial institutions and yet have no effect on actual underlying criminal activity. And they wind up hurting poor people, especially, who are less likely to have regular financial affairs and less likely to have all the multiple forms of identification that politicians and anti-money laundering laws require. So these laws have been a big net negative in terms of the financial sector and in terms of consumers, especially poor consumers. But we're not going to get rid of them, unfortunately, because politicians think of them as a way of making it easier to raise taxes in the future.
But interestingly, before this conversation, I wondered why don't we have more organizations in place like America lobbying for the elimination of anti-money laundering regulations?
There are free market organizations like the Center for Freedom of
Yeah,
Press.
other than you, exactly, other than you.
But it's not just that. If you go to the Cato Institute website, the Competitive Enterprise Institute website, I mean, the Heritage Foundation has done good work on this issue as well, fighting against the horribly misnamed Corporate Transparency Act. The problem is, though, that politicians care first and foremost not about the freedom of their citizens, not about economic growth, but they think about how can they get more power and more money. And that leads them to propose bad policies. It leads them to always think about collecting more tax money. And that's the mentality that we have to overcome.
And they're also hypocritical. So Mia Motley, she was recently bashing multilateral organizations and Europe due to their anti-money laundering regulations. But the problem with leaders in the Caribbean is that although they appreciate the effects of anti-money laundering regulations on the region, they don't have a problem creating internal anti-money laundering regulations. That's the issue. So they're not going to get up and say, okay, in Barbados, we're going to get rid of civil asset forfeiture. No, they're not. They're not going to do it in Jamaica. They're not going to do it anywhere, but they do have a problem with Western countries imposing these regulations on them because it deprives them of sovereignty. But beyond that, they don't care about getting rid of civil asset forfeiture completely. Like personally, I think that Jamaica should get rid of it completely. If you commit a crime, just go to prison. I don't care if you're a druggist or a dangerous criminal, just go to prison. Nobody should touch your money.
Well, I mean, I have written several columns about how civil assets forfeiture is a terrible idea. One of my main arguments is that the government can seize your money even when you haven't been convicted or even charged of a crime.
Yes.
So if you have a well-functioning, honest court system, and that well-functioning, honest court system says, because you did this bad thing, we're going to send you to jail for 5 years, and we're also going to fine you $100,000. Okay, that's fine. I mean, whether or not I agree that the penalty is too lenient or too severe, as long as it's an honest court system producing it, and you are not punished until you are found guilty, okay, that's reasonable. But civil asset forfeiture allows governments to basically steal your assets even when you haven't been convicted or even charged, in some cases, with any criminal activity. That's what's disgusting.
Well, I've read your reports, and I know that around over 20 years ago, you wrote an academic publication on money on tax havens, and you were saying that tax havens are not are not conduits for criminality. But for those of us who are not familiar with the concept of a tax haven, other than tax services, what are they selling? And what exactly is being sold by a tax haven? Because some people assume that a tax haven is a country where you don't pay taxes or the tax rates are low. But what are these countries selling?
Tax havens are first and foremost tend to be international financial centers because they usually don't have income taxes or they don't have the pervasive double taxation that you find in other countries. They're excellent platforms for cross-border economic activity. So if you're a multinational company or a multinational investor, basing yourself out of a so-called tax haven, makes a lot of sense. It's a way of having efficient, low cost economic activity. And one of the things you find about these so-called tax havens, they tend to score very, very high for rule of law. Why? Because multinational investors and multinational companies are not going to put their money at risk. You're not going to go to a place that has corrupt courts or things like that. So you look at some of the major international financial centers in the world: Singapore, Cayman Islands,
Bermuda.
Panama, Liechtenstein, Jersey. I mean, these are places that rank very, very high for having honest, non-corrupt judicial systems, for having very, very honest, sensible laws. And so, yes, I'm a big fan of international financial centers. Call them tax havens if you want. I want people to be able to invest more, create more wealth, and having low taxes either in your own country or by using a international financial center. That's a big plus.
I agree. I'm thinking about Jamaica as a tax haven. There is an organization in Jamaica called the Jamaica International Financial Services Association. I think that's the name of it. But Cayman has done well, Bermuda has done well, Bahamas has done well. What can Jamaica do? How would Jamaica differentiate her product then? Because it's beyond taxes. They're selling other services too, like insurance. What could Jamaica sell? As an expert, because you're the expert, now you're giving me free advice.
Well, I think probably first and foremost, if you're going to get into the business of being an international financial center, you better make sure that you score very high in the World Bank's governance indicators. In other words, you need honest courts, very strong rule of law, and things like that. Now, a few jurisdictions have done interesting things to try to promote that. In Dubai, you have the International Financial Center. And basically, that's an entirely separate legal system just for international investors, and they use foreign judges and things like that. So the perception is that it's a much more honest system. And so whether or not you use the Dubai strategy, whether you use the Cayman Islands strategy, it's simply a case of making sure that multinational investors and multinational companies see that if they use you as a platform for economic activity, you're going to score well. One thing that I would recommend, the 1841 Foundation publishes something every year called the Tax Hell Index. So instead of looking at measuring whether you're a tax haven, it measures whether you're a tax hell. And that's based on two different main, all sorts of variables, but sort of two main categories of variables. What is your fiscal pressure? In other words, how high are taxes? How big is government? How much debt is there? But then it also measures things like the World Bank governance indicators. So what makes you a tax hell isn't necessarily just having high taxes. It's, do you have poor rule of law along with high taxes? So you can actually, the flip side of being a tax hell is being a tax haven or a tax heaven in the 1841 Foundation's report. And some of the tax heavens in the 1841 Foundation report are kind of obvious. Ireland, relatively low taxes, good rule of law. Of course, they're a tax heaven by world standards. But you know who else is a tax heaven by world standards? Denmark. Now, Denmark doesn't have low taxes at all. It has high taxes. But because it has very high quality rule of law and very high quality governance, at least people are getting value for their money. The problem is some countries have very, very low scores for rule of law. So even if you have low taxes, it's not really going to help you that much. So you really have to, I would use that 1841 Foundation Tax Hell Index as a template because it shows you exactly the two main things that you need to do. Have good fiscal policy and have good rule of law. You do those two things, and you don't even have to make yourself an official tax haven or international financial center. You'll wind up attracting more investment, creating more jobs, delivering more prosperity for your people.
Yes, Jamaica. Again, I am not in Jamaica. I'm a writer. The funny thing about me is that I have more contact with people in the UK and America than in Jamaica. I really don't know a lot of prominent people in Jamaica anymore. But Jamaica reformed the constitution, and it's going to become a missed opportunity because nobody is talking about constitutional reform. I've written that Jamaica, in its new constitution, should get rid of the concept of a Pigovian tax. So the government should not be allowed to impose a fat tax or a carbon tax or anything like that. The focus on constitutional reform is to remove the King of England to become a republic. That's really the main focus, which I don't think is really important because I've read literature on the benefit of constitutional monarchies. But constitutional reform for Jamaica is going to become a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I remember being in Australia when they were debating whether to become a republic as opposed to having the King of England as a monarch. Well, who cares? I mean,
Nobody.
it doesn't have any practical effect. I mean, maybe if I was Australian or Jamaican, I would say, I flip a coin and say, okay, let's become a republic. But that's not going to change life for people in the country. That's going to be entirely dependent on whether or not the national politicians reduce government and make and lower taxes and deregulate and things like that.
All right. So I told you we're going to speak for 1 hour. We have been speaking for 1 hour and 54 seconds. It has been a great conversation, but unfortunately, we have to wrap up. And thanks for coming on. But yes.
Well, thank you.
All right.